Greetings, audiophiles and Legend of Korra fans. Oh, who am I kidding? Welcome, Bolin fans, to my reading of my fanfiction, Castle of Glass. Legend of Korra and the characters therein belong to their respective owners and creators. The original characters and the premise of this story belong to me. Enjoy! Part 2. Combinations. Kita let her father's words wash over her like a wave. She was used to them. Lazy, irresponsible, what would your mother think? She sat down at the pottery wheel as he continued to rant. Gently she bent some water from the basin beside her and infused it into the lump of clay on the wheel with practiced motions. She started the wheel turning with a few pumps of the foot pedal and held her hands over the rotating lump. The red clay formed and swirled as she manipulated the water within it. "Kita, are you listening?" her father snapped, coming to stand in front of the wheel. She stared so intently at her clay creation in progress that she thought she might give herself a headache. The muscles in her hands grew tighter, too tight. She crushed the clay, muddy water spurting free and splashing her clothes and her father's. He wiped the front of his apron with a rag and glared. "Honestly, Kita, is it really so bad, so horrible to work here? This is your home, where your family lives, where your mother grew up. Your art is beautiful, the talk of the village. Why are you unhappy?" Kita slammed her palms down on the pottery wheel, squeezing the remaining clay between her fingers. It felt good, cathartic. "Maybe I want a little bit more than this, Dad," she said, still not meeting his gaze. They were talking in circles. They'd been here before, so many times she felt like she was reciting from a script. "I'm a waterbender. I have more to offer than just making these vases and sculptures. I met a pro bender the other day. I could go pro, Dad. How cool would that be?" Her father raised an eyebrow at this deviation from her normal rebuttal. "Pro bender?" "Yes, I could make money bending, Dad. How awesome would that be?" "In Republic City." "Of course in Republic City. Where did you think?" "I just don't understand your obsession with the city. I've been there. It's dirty and dangerous. I am certainly not sending my only daughter there alone into that place. You could be robbed, or worse." He folded his arms. "I'd be careful," she pouted. It was no use, of course. None of it would ever change his mind. She had turned 17, the traditional age of adulthood, almost half a year ago, and her father had treated it like any other birthday. She had hoped that maybe he would finally see that she was old enough to be free. Prin fluttered down from her perch on the wall. Plopping down into her master's shoulder, she nuzzled Kita's cheek. The bell in the front of the shop jingled to indicate that someone had come in. Kita's father called out in his best salesman voice, "I'll be right there." He turned to his daughter. "Kita, do you mind?" She sighed, then raised a hand and swept it downward, pulling the damp clay from her father's clothes. She sailed the muck over to spiral above her hand, which she swirled in lazy motions. "Go," she said, indicating the door from the back room to the shop proper with her eyes. "This discussion isn't over." Torque wagged a finger at her and strode out to greet the customers. Kita guided the clay swirling above her hand to rejoin the mangled lump on the pottery wheel. She was about to set it spinning again with a sigh when her father called to her, his voice barely disguising annoyance. "Kita, the customer is asking for you." She stood, forgetting to clean the damp clay from her own clothes. She opened the door into the shop. The light from the front windows blinded her for a moment, but Prin leaped from her shoulder with a greedy squeak. "Prin, no!" She scolded the owlbat, but it was too late. "Hello, Prin," a familiar voice said. She blinked a few times and saw Bolin had been ready and caught the little creature before Prin could make another attempt to eat Pabu. The fire ferret had his head sticking out from the earthbender's collar and was hissing at Prin, who made annoyed peeping sounds in response. "Bolin!" Kita smiled, then realized she was still covered in clay. Her cheeks went red, and she hastily waved her hands, swiping the grime from her and guiding it into a waste bucket. "Hey!" He looked so happy to see her. His bright green eyes shone with merriment. She liked the way he smiled, so wide and unashamed. Most people guarded their smiles, but Bolin seemed to be full and earnest. She couldn't help but smile back. "This is the pro bender?" Her father raised an eyebrow. He didn't look pleased to see Bolin. "I sent this young man to find you the other day. I assumed he had failed." "Yeah, sorry about that." Bolin looked sheepish as he walked across the room and handed Prin back to Kita. "We, got to talking and I forgot." Torque rolled his eyes. He'd had to fend more than one young man off of his daughter. This was nothing new. "So, can I help you? All of these pieces are for sale." He gestured to a display of elegant clay vases and bowls. Bolin made a show of examining several of the items, hand to chin, an exaggerated, scrutinizing squint on his face. Kita stifled a giggle as she watched. After a moment, she spoke up. "Want to see how I make them?" she asked. Bolin looked at her, and she was again startled by his eyes. She had to look away quickly. "You bet I would," he said. She gestured to the back room, following him in. She watched him take in the unfinished or less than perfect pieces housed there. The room was spare, with wooden shelves along the walls, holding projects and supplies. There were the table and chairs where she and her father usually ate lunch, and her pottery wheel. The half-formed blob she had been working on was still there, a hunk of potential, waiting. Even though she had grown to hate the work, she was eager to show off. She rushed to her little stool, sitting down and spreading her fingers on either side of the would-be creation. She made sure Bolin was watching her. He was, and she almost giggled when she saw how eager and interested he looked. She started the wheel spinning and formed the clay with her water bending. It smoothed, rippled, swayed. She glanced up to see Bolin watching as though it was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. She almost lost her concentration. The clay bubbled slightly, and she nearly pulled the water out of it. It was a delicate balancing act to keep the water and clay united so she could control it. "It's like you're an earthbender," Bolin said, stepping closer and leaning down to watch. A little splash of clay came free and hit his nose. He stood back, blinking. Kita laughed. She couldn't contain herself. Her father was a serious stick in the mud, but Kita had an easy laugh that was always coming out at awkward moments. "I'm sorry," she managed, covering her mouth with her hands, as though he might not guess that she was laughing if she hid her smile. Bolin raised a thick eyebrow, then flicked a finger. A small blob of clay flew from her work and splashed her cheek, leaving what she could only assume was a reddish streak. Her mouth quirked into an impish grin, one that most people knew meant trouble. This Bolin didn't understand what he had unleashed. Torque poked his head into the back room to check on his daughter and her male friend. His brows came together in a severe scowl. Both the young people were covered in splashes of clay. Kita's creation was once again a humble blob on her pottery wheel. "Kita!" he snapped. Her head popped up from behind her chair that she had been using as cover. Her face and hair were streaked with clay. She caught sight of her father's expression and wished she could vanish behind the chair again. "Yes, Daddy?" she said in her most innocent voice. Bolin caught sight of the shopkeeper and snapped to attention, bobbing an apologetic bow as clay dripped from his hair. "I'm sorry, sir. We'll clean it up right away." Before Kita could rise from behind her chair, Bolin had his hands spread, gathering the clay from his own clothes and hers. It floated towards them and formed a ball between his hands. Then an idea struck Kita. "Bolin, put the clay back on the wheel." She rushed to her stool again, righting it, as they had knocked it over in their play. The earthbender lowered the ball he had created to rejoin the blob still on the wheel. Kita glanced at her father, who was watching with his same stern expression. A bell chimed again, and Torque unwillingly went to greet the new customers. "All right." Kita raised her hands to the clay. She nodded to Bolin, indicating that he should put his hands around the other side of the blob. She started the wheel spinning and began bending. Bolin understood without instruction, trying to match her smooth, precise movements as he earthbent. He stuck out his tongue in his concentration, which almost made Kita lose hers. He was cute. Really cute. She bit down on her bottom lip. Maybe she should ask him. "Bolin," Kita's father called from the store. Bolin took his hands away, and Kita stopped the spinning wheel. Their creation was odd, but somehow beautiful. Unplanned and intriguing, which was how she might have described her feelings about the young earthbender at the moment. Bolin took in their sculpture. "Not bad for my first art project ever," he smiled broadly. "You never made art in school?" Kita asked, squinting at their creation, wondering if she could change this or that. Bolin didn't answer, and she glanced up to see a sad look on his face. It had no place there. His features seemed unused to the expression, like a dark cloud on a previously sunny day. "I had better see what your father wants." Bolin jabbed his thumb towards the shop. "He already doesn't like me." "He doesn't like anybody," Kita joked, hoping to bring back Bolin's happiness, upset that she might have chased it away. Bolin walked to the door, sticking his head out with a cheery, "Yes, sir?" There was a pause, and she saw his muscles tighten. "Eska, what are you—" A female voice came next, flat and dour. "Bolin, I believe I made it clear that you were to wait for me outside the weapons shop. When I emerged, you were not there. This is unacceptable." "Yes, dear," Bolin replied. Kita tensed. "Dear? Girlfriend?" Bolin walked out into the shop, and she followed slowly. Her eyes widened as she took in the two people standing in her family store. The twins, Desna and Eska, the children of the tribal leader from the north, practically royalty. And Bolin was... She saw Eska's hand clamped around his. Bolin looked very tense. Catching Kita's eye, a blush rushed to his cheeks. Kita's father seemed pleased. He clasped his hands. "Would my illustrious visitors like to take a moment and enjoy my shop? All these fine pieces are handmade right here, one of a kind, each one." Made by slave labor, Kita thought grumpily. Her good mood was thoroughly stomped to death. She watched Bolin, who was avoiding her eyes, his hand still firmly held in Eska's. Was she his type? So... blank? Kita sighed. Go figure. She usually fell for the unattainable guys. Granted, her father personally intimidated most of her boyfriends away, but she liked to think she fell for the unattainable guy. That's what girls were supposed to do, right? "Come, Bolin. I have purchases I wish you to make for me," Eska pronounced coldly. Bolin allowed himself to be led out the door. At the last moment he glanced back over his shoulder. "Bye, Kita," he called weakly. "Bye." She raised her hand in a half-wave, then let it fall dejectedly back to her side. Well, that was a disappointment. But what had she been expecting? That the friendly, likable earthbender would be unattached? She shook her head and walked back to the art room. She caught a glimpse of her father's pleased expression and wished she could splash it with clay. She stood, examining the thing that she and Bolin had created together. She raised her hands over it, ready to push it back down into a virgin lump of clay once again. But she couldn't. Instead, she took a thin board from the floor beside the wheel and slid it under their creation. Then she carried it to the back of the room and opened the door to the steps to their house, which was above the shop. In her bedroom, she set it on her nightstand. Then, with a practiced motion, she pulled much of the water from the sculpture, hardening it. Firing it in their kiln would have been better, but this wasn't for selling. This was for keeping. She sighed, sitting on her bed and glancing at her window. Prin fluttered from her shoulder to her perch and began preening quietly. Soon Kita would escape for her waterbending lesson, but for the moment she sat, watching the cloudless sky through her window, not certain why she felt so melancholy.